Moscow, 1985. Mikhail Gorbachev had just become the youngest leader of the Soviet Union in decades, and he had a bold plan to save his nation. It wasn't about reforming the economy. It wasn't about diffusing nuclear tensions with the West. It was something far more personal, far more dangerous. He was going to take the bottle away from the Soviet people. Gorbachev's anti-alcohol campaign was one of the most ambitious and disastrous social experiments of the Cold War. In a country where vodka wasn't simply a drink, but part of the very fabric of Russian culture, where toasts sealed deals and shared bottles forged brotherhoods, the new Soviet leader declared war on centuries of tradition. What followed was an epic battle between the world's most powerful state and its people as most deeply rooted vice. Century-old vineyards were destroyed. Distilleries shuttered their doors. Lines to buy alcohol stretched for miles. And while the Kremlin celebrated its sobriety statistics, in the shadows, a clandestine moonshine empire was born that would poison thousands and cost the Soviet government billions of rubles. This is the story of how the Soviet Union tried to ban the impossible, and how that failure helped accelerate the collapse of a superpower. To understand the 1985 campaign, one must first examine the historical precedents that shaped Soviet attitudes toward alcohol regulation. The relationship between the Russian state and alcohol consumption had been intertwined with questions of revenue, social control, and public health for centuries prior to the Bolshevik Revolution. As early as 1652, during the reign of Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich Romanov, the Russian state recognized excessive alcohol consumption as a threat to social stability. Alexei implemented restrictions on tavern operations and attempted to limit the availability of spirits to the general population. These measures were motivated not solely by moral concerns, but by pragmatic considerations regarding labor productivity and tax collection efficiency. The tradition of state involvement in alcohol policy continued through subsequent centuries. In July 1914, at the outbreak of the First World War, Emperor Nicholas II ordered a comprehensive ban on the sale of vodka. This prohibition was framed as a wartime necessity, intended to maintain military discipline and industrial production during the conflict. The ban remained in effect throughout the war years, though its enforcement was inconsistent and black market production flourished in rural areas. Following the October Revolution of 1917, the Bolshevik government initially maintained the prohibition on vodka sales. In December 1917, Lenin's Council of People's Commissars extended the ban, viewing alcohol as both a capitalist vice and a threat to revolutionary consciousness. By 1919, the prohibition measures had been strengthened considerably. The production, sale, and distribution of alcohol were criminalized, with violators facing penalties of up to 5 years imprisonment and confiscation of property. Nevertheless, as the Soviet state consolidated its power and sought new sources of revenue during the new economic policy period, pragmatism superseded ideological purity. In August 1925, the government reversed course and authorized the resumption of state-controlled vodka production and sale. This decision reflected the state's need for hard currency and its recognition that prohibition had merely driven alcohol consumption underground rather than eliminating it. The Soviet project was fundamentally concerned with the creation of a new type of human, being the Homo Sovieticus, who would embody the ideals of socialist consciousness, physical fitness, and unwavering dedication to the collective good. Excessive alcohol consumption was antithetical to this vision, as it was associated with decreased labor productivity, increased criminality, and the persistence of pre-revolutionary social habits. Throughout the Stalin era, the Soviet government launched periodic anti-alcohol campaigns that combined propaganda with regulatory measures. In 1928, during the early years of the first five-year plan, the state established societies for struggle against alcoholism in major urban centers. These organizations, though ostensibly grassroots movements, were in fact state-sponsored entities designed to mobilize public opinion against drinking. The campaigns featured demonstrations, including highly publicized events where children carried banners demanding sober parents and calling for harsh penalties against chronic alcoholics. In January 1929, the Soviet government formalized its anti-alcohol stance through a series of regulatory decrees. These measures prohibited the opening of new vodka shops, banned alcohol sales on official holidays and paydays, and restricted sales in public spaces such as cafeterias, bathhouses, and parks. However, Stalin's attention soon shifted to the forced collectivization of agriculture and rapid industrialization, and the anti-alcohol campaign was effectively abandoned by 1930. The period following the Second World War witnessed a dramatic escalation in alcohol consumption across Soviet society. The war had inflicted extraordinary trauma on the population, with an estimated 27 million Soviet citizens killed between 1941 and 1945, millions of returning soldiers and civilians who had endured fascist occupation turned to vodka as a coping mechanism for psychological wounds. By the late 1950s, Soviet leadership recognized that alcohol consumption had reached levels that threatened economic productivity. Under Nikita Khrushchev, who was concerned that excessive drinking would undermine the ambitious goals of the 7-year plan, 1959 to 1965, the government implemented new restrictions in 1958. These measures severely limited the retail availability of vodka, restricting sales primarily to restaurants. The production of home-distilled spirits, known as semagon, was criminalized with substantial penalties. State enterprises were directed to produce lower-quality berry-based spirits, called cherva, as an alternative to traditional vodka. These measures, however, proved financially unsustainable. The state budget derived substantial revenue from vodka sales, and the production restrictions resulted in significant fiscal losses. Within 6 months, the Khrushchev-era prohibition was quietly dismantled, and vodka production resumed at previous levels. The administration of Leonid Brezhnev, which governed the Soviet Union from 1964 to 1982, witnessed the maturation of what Soviet sociologists termed the alcohol problem. In 1972, the government initiated another anti-alcohol campaign, this time attempting a more nuanced approach. Rather than prohibiting vodka entirely, the strategy centered on encouraging citizens to consume wine and beer as lower-proof alternatives. Production quotas for wine and beer were increased substantially, while vodka production was curtailed. The retail price of vodka was raised to discourage consumption, and new regulations prohibited the sale of spirits above 30% alcohol content after 7 p.m. Simultaneously, the state launched propaganda campaigns promoting sports participation and healthy lifestyles as alternatives to drinking culture. Despite these efforts, the campaign failed to produce meaningful behavioral change. By the early 1980s, as Brezhnev's tenure neared its end, official statistics indicated that the average Soviet citizen consumed between 100 and 110 bottles of vodka annually. According to Ministry of Health data, per capita alcohol consumption reached 10.5 liters of pure spirits per person in 1984, double the rate recorded during the Stalin era. The social consequences of widespread alcohol abuse had become impossible to ignore. Data compiled by the Ministry of Internal Affairs revealed alarming correlations between alcohol consumption and criminal activity. Approximately 40% of all traffic accidents, 67% of homicides, and 75% of assaults and robberies were committed by individuals under the influence of alcohol. Workplace surveys conducted in the mid-1980s indicated that 20% of male workers and 11% of female workers consumed alcohol during working hours. The demographic implications were equally concerning. Alcohol-related mortality rates increased by 45% between 1970 and 1984. Life expectancy for Soviet men which had been rising steadily through the 1960s, began to decline in the 1970s, a phenomenon unprecedented in industrialized nations during peacetime. Medical researchers attributed much of this decline to alcohol-related diseases, including cirrhosis, cardiovascular conditions, and alcohol poisoning. Moreover, grassroots pressure for government action had been mounting. Throughout the early 1980s, the Central Committee received thousands of letters from Soviet women mothers, wives and sisters, pleading with party leadership to address alcoholism's impact on families and communities. These appeals carried particular weight within party circles, as they came from constituencies traditionally supportive of Soviet power. When Mikhail Gorbachev assumed the position of General Secretary in March 1985, he inherited a Soviet Union facing multiple interconnected crises: economic stagnation, technological backwardness relative to the West, and widespread social malaise. At age 54, Gorbachev represented a generational shift in Soviet leadership, and he arrived with ambitious plans for reform that would later be encapsulated in the twin concepts of glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring. Gorbachev's personal views on alcohol were shaped by both ideological commitment and biographical experience. He was known within party circles as a light drinker who viewed alcohol abuse as both a moral failing and an economic drain. His close allies in the Politburo, including Yegor Ligashev and Mikhail Solomentsov, shared his conviction that alcohol consumption represented an obstacle to Soviet modernization. On May 16, 1985, the Central Committee issued a comprehensive decree titled "On Measures to Overcome Drunkenness and Alcoholism." The campaign that followed was unprecedented in scope and ambition. Production quotas for vodka and other spirits were slashed by approximately 30%. Thousands of retail outlets selling alcohol were closed. Estimates suggest that roughly 50% of liquor stores across the Soviet Union ceased operations between 1985 and 1987. Sales restrictions were imposed with bureaucratic precision. Alcohol could only be purchased between 2 p.m. and 7 p.m., and sales were prohibited entirely on weekends and official holidays. The minimum legal drinking age was raised from 18 to 21. Vineyards across the southern Soviet republics received orders to uproot grapevines and convert agricultural land to other crops, a decision that would have long-term economic consequences for regions dependent on wine production. The propaganda apparatus mobilized with characteristic Soviet thoroughness. State media launched intensive campaigns promoting sobriety as a patriotic duty. Schools implemented mandatory anti-alcohol education programs. Factory workers were required to attend lectures on the dangers of drinking. Citizens found intoxicated in public spaces faced administrative penalties, including fines and mandatory enrollment in treatment programs. The campaign also introduced economic incentives designed to discourage consumption. Prices for vodka and other spirits increased by 25 to 30%. Workers in certain industries could receive bonuses for maintaining sobriety, while those caught drinking on the job faced dismissal. The state established a network of sobering-up stations, vitris vitelli, where intoxicated individuals were detained and charged substantial fees for their release. The immediate statistical results of Gorbachev's anti-alcohol campaign appeared promising. Official data indicated that alcohol consumption declined by approximately 25% between 1985 and 1987. Hospital admissions for alcohol poisoning decreased, as did arrests for public intoxication. Some demographers have argued that life expectancy among Soviet men increased slightly during this period, though the attribution remains contested. However, beneath these superficial indicators of success, a campaign generated profound unintended consequences that ultimately contributed to its failure and, arguably, to broader instability within Soviet society. The most immediate problem was the proliferation of illicit alcohol production. With legal vodka in short supply, millions of Soviet citizens turned to Samagon home-distilled spirits of varying quality and safety. By 1987, estimates suggested that Samagon production had tripled compared to pre-campaign levels. The consumption of dangerous alcohol substitutes also spiked dramatically. Desperate individuals consumed industrial spirits, cologne, medicinal tinctures, and other products containing alcohol, resulting in thousands of poisoning deaths. The economic ramifications proved equally severe. The Soviet state budget had long derived substantial revenue from alcohol sales. By some estimates, alcohol taxes accounted for 12 to 15% of state revenue in the early 1980s. The dramatic reduction in legal alcohol sales created a fiscal shortfall of billions of rubles annually at precisely the moment when Gorbachev's economic reforms required significant public investment. This revenue loss contributed to the growing budget deficits that plagued the Soviet economy during the late 1980s. The destruction of vineyards in traditional wine-producing regions generated lasting resentment. In Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine, grape cultivation represented not merely an economic activity, but a cultural tradition extending back centuries. The arbitrary orders to uproot established vineyards struck many residents of these republics as an act of cultural imperialism by Moscow. This resentment would later feed into nationalist movements that challenged Soviet authority. Moreover, the campaign fostered widespread cynicism toward government authority. The sight of citizens queuing for hours outside the limited number of stores still selling alcohol became a symbol of Soviet inefficiency. The disconnect between official proclamations about the campaign's success and the lived reality of Soviet citizens unable to purchase alcohol legally undermined the credibility of state institutions. Black markets flourished, controlled increasingly by organized criminal networks. The mafia structures that emerged during this period to manage illicit alcohol distribution would later diversify into other activities during the chaotic post-Soviet transition. In this sense, the anti-alcohol campaign inadvertently contributed to the growth of organized crime that would plague Russia in the early 1990s. By late 1987, the political consensus supporting the anti-alcohol campaign had eroded. Yegor Ligashev, who had been a principal architect of the policy, faced growing criticism from other Politburo members concerned about the fiscal crisis and popular discontent. Gorbachev himself, increasingly preoccupied with broader reform efforts and foreign policy challenges, distanced himself from the campaign. In October 1988, the government quietly began reversing the restrictions. Production quotas for vodka were increased, and retail hours were extended. By 1989, most of the campaign's regulatory structure had been dismantled. The formal end came without official announcement or acknowledgement of failure. The restrictions simply ceased to be enforced. The immediate aftermath saw alcohol consumption rebound sharply. By 1992, in the early years of post-Soviet Russia, per capita alcohol consumption had exceeded pre-campaign levels. The brief period of forced sobriety had done nothing to address the underlying social, economic, and psychological factors driving excessive drinking. The long-term consequences of the failed campaign extended far beyond alcohol policy. The destruction of vineyards resulted in the permanent loss of specialized agricultural knowledge and established cultivation practices. Wine production in formerly prominent regions required decades to recover. The fiscal losses contributed to the Soviet government has declining ability to fund essential services and maintain economic stability. Perhaps most significantly, the anti-alcohol campaign's failure demonstrated the limits of state power in shaping personal behavior, even within an authoritarian system. The campaign had presumed that social engineering through bureaucratic decree could overcome deeply embedded cultural practices and individual preferences. This assumption proved catastrophically wrong. The Soviet anti-alcohol campaign of 1985 represents more than a failed public health initiative. It serves as a case study in the hubris of centralized planning and the unintended consequences of well-intentioned but poorly designed social interventions. The campaign's architects genuinely believed they could reshape Soviet society through administrative fiat, yet they failed to anticipate how citizens would resist, adapt, and circumvent restrictions they viewed as illegitimate. The legacy of the Sukhoi Zakon continues to influence Russian public health policy. Subsequent governments have approached alcohol regulation with considerably more caution, recognizing that prohibition measures tend to generate black markets and criminal activity rather than sobriety. Contemporary Russia continues to grapple with high rates of alcohol consumption, but policymakers now favor gradual regulatory approaches over sweeping prohibitions. For historians examining the collapse of the Soviet Union, the anti-alcohol campaign offers important insights. The campaign's failure illuminated the growing disconnect between the state's ambitions and its capacity for implementation. It revealed the erosion of ideological commitment among Soviet citizens, who increasingly viewed government policies as obstacles to circumvent rather than directives to obey. And it demonstrated that even an authoritarian state cannot indefinitely ignore economic realities or popular resistance. If you found this exploration of lesser-known Cold War history valuable, please consider subscribing to this channel and enabling notifications. As always, it bears remembering that history is rarely black and white, but rather exists in shades of gray, and that understanding these complexities is essential for comprehending our present world.